The rain had started as a steady drizzle falling over the training compound like an unwelcome guest, but soon it gathered force until it pounded the earth with relentless rhythm, soaking everything in sight and swallowing sound in its watery roar. Inside the barracks, the cadets laughed, their voices carrying through the corridors, as if the storm outside was merely background noise to their little game, a game they had chosen to play on one of their own, the lone female who had endured weeks of grueling drills, endless runs across the mud-filled field, and endless shouts from instructors who seemed determined to break her spirit. Yet still she had remained standing stronger each time, though some among the cadets could not accept her presence. So they hatched their plan. She had stepped outside earlier in the evening to retrieve gear left by the obstacle course, the storm gathering on the horizon not yet fully unleashed, and when she returned to the compound door, dripping with the first signs of rain, she found it locked, bolted from within, and the sound of muffled laughter seeping through the cracks. She banged on the door once, twice, 3 times, her fists echoing against metal, but no one moved to let her in. Instead, the laughter grew louder, and she realized with a slow sinking certainty that this was no mistake. This was deliberate. The rain fell harder until it clung to her skin like ice and seeped through her uniform, chilling her bones. Yet she refused to step. Back, she pressed her palms against the cold steel of the door, again shouting for them to open it. Her voice carried away by the howling wind, the storm answering louder than any human ear could hear, but inside they heard and chose not to act. The cadets had decided this was the night they would prove she did not belong, and their cruelty gave them courage to defy even decency. Her body trembled under the weight of the storm, the mud sucking at her boots as if to drag her down into the earth itself. And for a moment she wondered if this was what they wanted to see her, beaten, broken, begging for entry, but something inside her snapped. Not with weakness, but with defiance. She squared her shoulders and let the rain wash across her face. Her jaw clenched as lightning lit up the compound around her, revealing every crack in the walls, every shadow lurking in corners, as if nature itself wanted to show her the truth, that survival was not about comfort, but about the will to keep moving. Minutes stretched into hours or so, it felt the storm refusing to relent, the thunder rattling through her chest with each strike, and still the door remained closed. She thought of all the times she had carried more weight than others, all the times she had run farther and pushed harder to silence the whispers that she was less capable. She thought of the instructors who told her that every soldier must endure pain beyond reason to find the edge of their strength. And in that moment, she understood that this night was not just their test, it was hers as well, and she would not fail. She stepped back from the door, her breath heavy clouds in the cold night air, and looked around the compound. Lights flickered through the sheets of rain, illuminating fences topped with barbed wire and fields drowned in water. She was trapped, yet not powerless. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her crawl into despair. Instead, she made a vow, her heart pounding louder than the storm, she would return, not as the victim of their cruelty, but as the reminder that she was never truly alone. Her thoughts turned to the men she knew, the ones who trained in silence at the far edge of the base, their names whispered with reverence by all who wore the uniform, the SEALs who had walked through fire and shadow, who had seen war in its ugliest form, and yet stood unbroken. She remembered one night at the range when their leader had spoken to her quietly, telling her that strength was not measured by how many stood against you, but by how many stood with you. When the fight grew dark, and now under the storm, she knew exactly what she must do. With one final glance at the door, still locked tight behind her, and the mocking laughter muffled now by walls but no less cruel, she turned her back and walked into the storm, each step sinking into the mud as if the earth itself tried to hold her. But her resolve pushed her forward. The rain whipped at her face, the wind clawed at her uniform, and Still, she moved each stride heavier yet filled with purpose. Inside, the cadets grew quieter, their laughter fading as some began to wonder if they had gone too far, but none moved to unlock the door, pride and arrogance chaining them more tightly. Than any lock, they believed she would return desperate, that she would come crawling back to beg entry. But what they did not see, what they could not even imagine, was that her steps were carrying her farther away from weakness and closer to power. Compound lights disappeared behind her, swallowed by the rain, and the night stretched wide open before her, every sound magnified, every shadow alive. Yet she pressed on her heart, driving her forward with one singular thought: she would not face this storm alone. She would bring back a force that no cadet could laugh away. She pushed through the forest path leading toward the edge of the base, where the barracks of the SEALs stood hidden in the dark, the storm tearing at branches above her, the mud threatening to pull her down with every step. And though her muscles screamed, her spirit refused to break. She moved with the determination of someone who knew that the only way to reclaim her honor was to stand taller than those who tried, to strip it away. At one point, the lightning illuminated the sky, revealing the twisted wire fences and watchtowers around the base, and she realized how small she looked compared to the vast machinery of military order. But instead of shrinking, she felt herself grow, because she knew size meant nothing when resolve burned hotter than fear. The path grew rougher, the storm louder, and every moment felt like a test designed to crush her. Yet she carried on, each step a declaration, each breath a promise that she would not let this night define her as broken, but instead as unbreakable. And with each moment she grew closer to the place where shadows moved with purpose, and where loyalty meant more than cruelty ever could. She thought of the faces of those who had once doubted her, even among the SEALs, until she had proven herself on the range, until she had carried one of their own out of a training accident, refusing to leave him behind. She remembered the nod she received that night from the leader, and how it had been the first silent acknowledgement that she had earned something beyond respect. She had earned belonging, and that was why tonight she knew she could walk into their storm-lit barracks and ask for nothing, but receive everything. Her boots splashed through puddles as the rain turned the ground into rivers. Her uniform clung to her skin, heavy like chains. But each step was liberation, and when she finally saw the faint glow of lights from the distant barracks, her heart surged, because she knew she was no longer just enduring. She was arriving. But even as she approached the distant building, the storm seemed to grow angrier, the thunder shaking the ground beneath her feet, and the wind roaring as, though daring her to turn back yet, she pressed forward until she stood at the threshold, her hand reaching for the door that would open, not just to warmth and shelter, but to the allies who would change the balance of this night forever. And just as she reached for it, the lightning split the sky once more, and in its flash she thought she saw a figure watching from the shadows, a reminder that not every battle was over, and that what awaited inside could either restore her honor or test it even more than the storm outside. She stepped inside the barracks, dripping with rain, her boots leaving muddy trails across the floor as the storm outside continued to batter the night. And in that moment, all eyes turned toward her. The SEALs had been gathered in silence, some cleaning weapons, some checking gear, others simply resting. But when she appeared, every head lifted and every gaze locked onto her. She stood there, shoulders squared, uniform-soaked hair plastered to her face and eyes, burning with something that cut sharper than the storm, and without hesitation she began to speak. Her voice was low at first, but carried a weight that filled the room. She told them how the cadets had turned on her, how they had locked her out in the pouring rain, laughing as she pounded against the door. She spoke of the storm that had drenched her until her bones felt frozen, and how she had realized that this was not a prank, but a test designed to break her spirit. She paused, letting the silence fall heavy, and in that silence the SEALs shifted their gazes between one another, reading the truth in her tone, the fire in her stance, the refusal to bend. The leader of the SEALs rose from his chair, a tall man whose presence filled the room without effort. His face carved with years of battles, and his eyes the color of steel, sharpened by everything he had seen. He studied her for a long moment, saying nothing as the storm rattled the windows. Then finally he gave a slow nod, and in that nod was a decision that needed no words. The SEALs began to move, gear was pulled from lockers with efficiency, each motion precise and practiced weapons checked, though they knew this was not a mission that required bullets, but presence boots, laced tighter, and jackets thrown on as if the storm itself were another battlefield to step into. She watched as the room transformed in seconds, from quiet to readiness, the silent machine of a team that understood purpose more than pride. Her heart pounded as she realized what was happening. They were not preparing because of orders. No commander had given them this task. They were moving because they had heard her story, seen her strength, and chosen to stand. With her, it was not pity that fueled them. It was respect earned, not asked for, and it surged through her veins like fire warming her body that had been frozen only moments before. The leader approached her, standing close enough that she could feel the quiet authority radiating from him. He did not ask if she was certain, he did not question whether this was the right move. He only said one line low and deliberate. "We do not leave our own dishonored," and with those words, he turned back to his team and gave a gesture that signaled the march had begun. They moved out into the storm shadows, cutting across the flooded ground, their boots striking in rhythm that spoke of countless missions carried out together. She kept pace among them, her body aching from the hours in the rain, but her spirit lifted higher with each step, for she was no longer walking alone. Now the storm was theirs to command. The path back to the cadet compound stretched across the base, shrouded in darkness. The rain relentless, the wind howling through trees and wires. Yet the SEALs moved as if the storm were nothing more than background noise. Their silence spoke louder than any words. Each step calculated, each glance sharp, scanning the surroundings, as if the very night itself were an enemy to outmaneuver, and she realized with awe that this was what true unity felt like. As they approached the compound, she felt her breath tighten, the memory of standing outside those locked doors still raw. In her chest, she imagined the cadets still laughing inside, perhaps growing uneasy now, perhaps sensing that their game had gone further than they intended, but she knew that whatever fear they might begin to feel would be nothing compared to the weight that was about to enter their world. The storm seemed to grow heavier as they drew closer, sheets of water cutting across the field, thunder cracking above them, and yet the SEALs never slowed, never faltered, moving with the same steady rhythm. As though each drop of rain was a drumbeat guiding them forward, she kept her eyes fixed on the compound lights flickering through the downpour, and each flicker reminded her of the faces inside, smug and certain of their victory, until now one of. The SEALs glanced at her as they neared the gates, his face unreadable, but his eyes carried something that steadied her resolve. It was not pity, it was trust, as if he already saw her as part of them, as if her struggle had already earned her place, in ways the cadets could never understand. The gates loomed ahead, tall and unyielding, but the SEALs passed through with ease, their clearance unquestionable, and as they stepped into the compound, the storm seemed to follow them, carried inside on. Their boots, their jackets, their very presence, the cadets who had mocked her hours earlier had no idea of the force now walking toward them. Inside the barracks, the laughter that had once filled the halls was beginning to fade. Some of the cadets, pacing uneasy, others pretending not to care, but all of them caught off guard when the door opened and shadows moved across the threshold, heavy boots striking the floor in a cadence that froze them in place. She stepped in first, her eyes scanning, the room, her soaked uniform clinging to her, but her stance unshaken, and behind her, The SEALs filled the space with a silence heavier than thunder. The cadets stared wide-eyed, their smirks gone, their pride shrinking under the weight of the authority that had just entered. No words were spoken yet. The room crackled with tension, the kind that tightened the air until breathing itself felt heavy. The cadets looked at one another, waiting for someone to speak, for someone to break the silence, but no one dared, for the presence of the SEALs was enough to strip away every ounce of arrogance. The leader of the SEALs finally stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the room without needing to land on any one face, because his authority was not about individuals. It was about the collective shame that now bound them together. He did not raise his voice, he did not need to. His silence demanded answers, and none came. She felt the storm within her quieting as she stood flanked by those who had chosen to stand with her, the power of their presence filling the void where her humiliation had once been. And though she said nothing, the cadets could see in her eyes that she was no longer the outcast they tried to break. She was now the reminder that strength was never theirs to decide. The storm outside raged louder, as if echoing the storm now brewing inside the barracks. Yet even as thunder shook the ground and lightning lit the windows, the silence inside was heavier, more suffocating than anything nature could conjure. And still the SEALs stood still, waiting, watching their presence a warning, their loyalty a shield. And just when the cadets thought the silence could not stretch any longer, the leader of the SEALs took one slow step forward, his boots striking the floor with deliberate weight, and his eyes locked on the group who dared to challenge one of their own. And in that look was a promise that the storm they unleashed was only just beginning. The silence stretched across the room like a blade slicing through every heartbeat, and no one dared to move as the SEALs filled the barracks with their quiet dominance. The cadets who had once laughed now sat frozen, their arrogance draining away as reality settled over them, and the storm outside slammed against the walls like drums echoing the reckoning about to unfold. She stood at the front, her soaked uniform clinging to her, but her spine straight and her gaze steady. She had walked back into the very place that had rejected her. Yet she was not the same figure who had pounded on the door hours before. She was stronger, now shielded not by walls but by the force of loyalty that surrounded her, and as her eyes locked on the faces of the cadets, she saw the flicker of fear there, though none of them dared to admit it aloud. The leader of the SEALs took another step forward, his presence enough to make the air itself feel heavy, his silence cutting deeper than any words could ever manage. He surveyed the cadets as if he were reading their very souls, measuring them against a standard none of them could meet. And when he stopped at the center of the room, his stillness was louder than thunder. One cadet shifted uneasily, trying to muster the courage to speak. But when the leader's gaze snapped toward him, the words died in his throat, swallowed by the weight of authority that pressed down on them all. And in that moment, every one of them understood what they had done was no longer just a cruel joke. It had become a betrayal of something sacred, something greater than themselves. She stepped forward now, her boots striking the floor with the rhythm of someone who no longer cared for their approval. Her voice cutting into the silence like steel. She told them how she had endured the storm, how she had walked into the night alone and come back not broken but unbreakable. She told them that respect was never theirs to grant or withhold, because respect was earned in the fire of trials, and she had walked through that fire and returned with the storm at her side. The cadets lowered their eyes, some biting their lips, others clenching fists at their sides, but none dared to answer her words because they knew deep down that she spoke a truth they could not deny, and the truth weighed on them heavier than the rain outside. The leader of the SEALs finally broke his silence, his voice low but resonant, carrying through the room with the force of command. He told the cadets that what they had done was not simply cruelty, but weakness, and weakness had no place among those who claimed to wear the uniform. He reminded them that honor was not forged in laughter at the suffering of another, but in standing together when the storm threatened to tear everything apart. Each word struck the cadets like a hammer blow, their pride crumbling beneath the weight of shame, and still the SEALs did not move. They stood like statues, unyielding, silent sentinels of loyalty and strength, and in their presence, the cadets felt smaller than they ever had before. The storm outside rattled the windows, lightning flashing to illuminate every face inside the room, and for a fleeting second, she saw herself reflected in their eyes, not as a victim, not as an outcast, but as someone who had survived what they could not even imagine, and she knew then that the balance of power had shifted forever. One of the younger cadets finally broke, crumbling under the silence, his voice cracking as he muttered, "An apology." But it fell flat against the walls because it was not her forgiveness. He saw it. It was the release of pressure building around him. Yet no one moved to comfort him. No one dared to look for mercy in the faces of the SEALs. She stepped closer to the center of the room, her voice steady, as she told them that the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm within her. The storm they had awakened when they tried to strip her dignity. She told them that storms did not break her. Storms forged her, and every drop of rain had only hardened her resolve until she returned not alone, but with those who truly understood what it meant to fight for one another. The cadets remained silent, each word cutting into them deeper than any punishment an instructor could deliver, because this was not training. This was real. This was the kind of reckoning that left scars on pride and on memory, and they would carry it long after the storm had passed. The leader of the SEALs looked at her then, his expression unreadable yet filled with recognition. He gave her the faintest nod, one that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. And in that nod she felt everything she had fought for, everything she had endured, crystallize into truth. She belonged here, not because the cadets allowed it, but because she had earned it beyond question. The storm roared louder, as if nature itself confirmed the moment, thunder shaking the ground beneath their boots.